Welcome to Uncertain Things. This is Adaam. Vanessa is still on her, I suppose, maternity leave. Does it still count as maternity leave at this point in America? I don't know, but she's benefiting from it. And I benefit from having the pleasure of having Greg Lukianoff and Nadine Strossen as my guests to discuss their latest publication. What was it called? 10 Arguments Against Free Speech?
The War on Words.
It's a fascinating little polemic taking on the most recently common arguments against the First Amendment, the liberal tradition of free speech, and taking them apart. Greg, who is the head of FIRE, and Nadine, who comes from the eminent ACLU, bringing the best arguments in defense of this liberal tradition and answer these common threats. But I want to start with first giving you both a chance to share a bit of your background, how you got to this project, and then I have a bit of a general question about it. So Nadine, let's start with you.
Okay, thank you. It's great to be here to share the podium with both of you, and it's a great honor to have co-authored this book with my longtime friend and colleague, Greg. The subtitle of War on Words is The 10 Worst Arguments Against Free Speech and Why They Fail. And it actually resulted from a series of blog posts that Greg and I did on his wonderful blog for the FIRE website, The Eternally Radical Idea, because both of us constantly speaking and advocating about free speech found that we were constantly receiving the same counter arguments over and over and over again. And while both of us delight in engaging with live audiences and responding respectfully, but forcefully and effectively to those arguments, we thought it would be wonderful to concretize those answers in writing. And actually, Greg and I each started that project independently. Greg on his blog post, and I did it on my own. And then somehow Greg invited me to also post my answers on the FIRE website. And a couple of years later, my friend and colleague, Bernard Schweitzer, who is the publisher of Heresy Press, the founder of it, I'm on his advisory committee. He had published a number of fiction works, and he wanted to publish a nonfiction work, and he approached me, and I said, how about turning this series of blog posts into a book, because he wanted a concise book and he wanted it to be about free speech. And to my great joy, Greg thought it was a good idea, and the rest is history.
And meanwhile, for me, like I find this all kind of surreal to a degree, because I was like the weird law student who went to law school specifically to study the First Amendment, to specialize in freedom of speech. And I interned at the ACLU, and in my third year, maybe second year, so like 1999-ish at Stanford, I was introduced to Nadine Strossen by my mentor, Kathleen Sullivan. I even remember where it was. It was in the Kresge Auditorium. Nadine was speaking, and I was like, oh my God, this is like my total hero.
Greg, I remember it vividly too. And it was...
You do?
Yeah, you can tell me what the year would have been, but I make about 200 public presentations per year. No exaggeration. I keep a list. And so this was like thousands of presentations ago, but I have a literal visual memory of where I was sitting, and you were standing a little bit down. I must have been on some kind of podium below me, and you made such a deep impression, not only because of how you presented yourself and your palpable enthusiasm about and commitment to free speech. We were then talking, it was a panel about freedom of speech online. At that point, the internet was still fairly new, so it must have been in the 1990s. And my dear friend and colleague, Kathleen Sullivan, who was the dean of Stanford Law School and a great expert on free speech, had also said very strong, positive things about Craig. So you stuck with me, Craig. I think we were bound to be collaborators.
Oh, wow. That means the world to me. And so Nadine and I have gotten to work together a lot over my career, which is kind of a dream come true. And she's now actually a senior fellow at FIRE, which also kind of blows me away. So I've had the opportunity to work with her many times. And
he's my boss, right? Because he's the head. I'm only
she always mentions this, and that makes me profoundly uncomfortable. And she mentions it partially because she knows I'm like, I don't know. I feel weird about this.
No, we can inspire the students, the young people in the audience, that they too can grow up to become free speech heroes and work with whoever their current heroes are.
I feel incredibly lucky. But I do actually remember how because originally I wrote this as a list for a now defunct publication called Aereo. And it was just something that I just was like, I'm really mad about the following things, and I just rattled it off. And I think Nadine read it, and she's like, oh, it's interesting that we all come to the same conclusions, but we get to them different ways. So when I started actually writing it for Eternally Radical Idea, which at first was something that was just hosted on the FIRE blog, but now is a Substack, it's like, yeah, maybe we should just, go back and forth and kind of like, we'll take some of these arguments like words or violence, and then, we'll have Nadine's take and then we'll have my take, but we won't actually look at each other's at all in advance. And of course, there's that little bit of like, oh, maybe we'll say exactly the same thing. And often we say similar things, but we tend to come at it from such a different tone, style. It makes for, it was always delightful to read, Nadine's angle on it as well. So this has been a very fun project for me as well.
Well, the idea of free speech continues to be the eternally radical idea. Greg, can you, I've quoted you in some of my writings because I think that's so, you explain so much about why we are constantly facing the same arguments and responding to them. Can you explain why you chose that name for your great? Yeah,
Nadine and I, and actually even more so me, because like when Nadine was starting her career, free speech was kind of on the ascendancy, but it wasn't quite there yet. I was lucky enough to grow up in like the 80s and 90s where there was a sort of veneration for free speech. The First Amendment was really starting to be very, very strongly interpreted from the 60s on up. It just seemed to get better, not exclusively, but mostly. And then it was kind of like a commonly held idea of like, what's one of the things that make America special is this idea of freedom of speech being kind of central to our identity. And I feel lucky enough that I grew up in a time where you could almost take it for granted, but I also love history. And what people really need to get is that when people started sort of like lamenting, freedom of speech going by the wayside, it's like, you do get that it's a really weird thing historically to have a lot of respect for, honestly, human rights at all, and certainly freedom of speech, at least in any kind of extensive kind of way. So I always make the point that in every generation, people rise up to oppose freedom of speech, and they're usually on the winning side. Generally, people want their own freedom of speech, but even then, not always. But they don't want other people to have it. Particularly if they're going to say bad things or blasphemous things or sexy things, they'd rather it go away if it raises their blood pressure in the least, or undermines cohesion or makes them think dirty thoughts, all of this kind of stuff. And so my point is, and one of the reasons why I named my Substack the Eternally Radical Idea, because you want to remind people like freedom of speech is always a radical idea. It's not a liberal idea. It's not a conservative idea. It is a radical idea in every generation and in every moment.
Don't mind me, but I do have one note, because I remember reading you make that point. It's not a liberal idea. It's not a conservative idea. I think it's interesting. It's also one of the essays that you respond to is free speech is a right-wing conspiracy. But I think just the word liberal. I'm Israeli, so I come from the more connected to the European tradition of using the word liberal to describe the traditional liberalism. And I think free speech not only is fundamentally a liberal idea in that sense, in the classical liberal sense.
Yes, agreed.
I think I would even extend liberalism as the true eternally radical idea. My sometimes boss, Jonah Goldberg, in his book, The Suicide of the West, he described...
Great book. Not a great title, but great book.
Horrible title. He'd be first to say so. He described the liberal revolution as the miracle, which I also have never been a fan of, but I think it does capture just how rare it is and how lucky we are to live in a century that not only enjoys the fruits of liberalism, but as you pointed out, takes it for granted, so much so that it is almost a form of a cliche in our language, in the way we think about this and the way we think about a free society. It is almost tired that people search for alternatives to feel like they are reinventing themselves or they're finding a new, more radical revolution, but in truth are just dragging themselves backward to more ancient ideas like tribalism or totalitarianism. And this is one of the threats facing the notion of respecting speech that you don't like, which is the true essence of free speech, right?
You know, I just got back from Poland, where a book I had written several years ago about hate speech is being published in Polish. And it is one of many experiences I've had with countries that relatively recently were subject to really overt censorship and repression, because I see that at least those who are older, who remember those times, do not take free speech for granted and are so passionate about it and great defenders of it. Likewise, in this country, the more overt the repression is, the more converts you get to at least some free expression. So a silver lining to Donald Trump's recent unprecedented assault on free speech is that a lot of people who, to their shame, should have been outspoken defenders in the recent past, including university presidents and professors and students, are suddenly discovering how precious it is and how fragile it is.
Though that brings a big question of whether these are true converts. In the same token, you can argue that Republicans have discovered the importance of free speech when it was them who were being targeted by deplatforming or other kind of hate speech codes, right? So the question isn't whether you defend free speech when you're under the attack, right? But let's get to this, actually, because this was supposed to be my starting point. The thing that really made me fall in love with America, I got to say, as a foreigner, the thing that made me not just fall in love with America as an experiment, America as an ideal, right? Which is what we always look to see it as in order to improve our own behavior and our own politics. But America as an experiment really clicked to me when I first learned about the Skokie Affair. Oh. So this was a true moment of feeling the wheels of my head turning and realizing that my worldview is shifting and I did not know yet where. So, Greg, can you first give us a quick recount of the Skokie Affair?
Me?
Yes.
Nadine Strossen should be giving this.
No. I want to hear it from you, somebody from the outside who probably had the same kind of more heroic experience of it.
I'm a first generation American. My dad, fled communism. My mom, fled being a poor Irish girl in England. And I remember being and I grew up in a neighborhood with a lot of other first generation immigrant kids. And we were like, hold on, are these people genuinely so principled that Jewish lawyers were willing to defend the Nazis? And that made it a powerful impression on us. Like, these people really mean it. Like, how noble. And honestly, like that was...
Can you give us the details in case one of our listeners isn't...
Oh, right. Sorry. That's right. Okay, so crazy crackpot. I forget what his last name was. He wanted to protest with his neo-Nazi group in Illinois. And he wanted, and this is the worst part of it, is he wanted to actually march in a town that had a large population of survivors of the Holocaust. And understandably, there was a lot of revulsion to this idea, and there were multiple legal attempts to prevent the march from happening. And obviously, nobody likes this guy. Obviously, nobody likes the Nazis. But the ACLU came to the defense of neo-Nazis, even in this highly unsympathetic case in the late 1970s. And it really made an impression, and again, like there were David Goldberger, was leading the charge. Ari Nair, wrote an incredible book called Defending My Enemy about it, which, by the way, Fire and the ACLU are republishing this summer. Ari's account of why, someone who survived the Holocaust himself was willing to defend the rights of even his enemy in that case. It's also, by the way, the reason why, like in Blues Brothers, they say, "I hate Illinois Nazis." It's actually a reference to Skokie. So that was the case. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, but we're in the presence of Nadine Strossen, to explain her experience with that and what it was like being on the ground both before and after that.
Well, I wasn't an ACLU leader yet at the time. I had only recently graduated from law school. I was simply one of thousands of lawyers around the country who were acting as volunteer lawyers for certain ACLU cases. And I was on the board of my state ACLU affiliate. So we in Minnesota, so not too far away from Illinois. And it was a very hotly debated topic among the public as a whole, not only throughout the United States, but it really garnered worldwide attention. And it was very seriously debated among ACLU members. Famously, the ACLU lost 15% of our members, even people who were such diehard free speech supporters that they forked out the money to become card-carrying ACLU members, said this is a bridge too far. And it's the same dichotomy I see today. And I think one of the reasons why Greg and I wrote our book, that on the one hand, the law and the courts who uphold the law are very supportive of free speech, even for the most hateful, hated speech. Greg points out that this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, where we won with the Supreme Court. It ruled in favor of the ACLU on a summary basis without even receiving oral arguments or briefs. That's how straightforward a First Amendment issue it was. Let me put on my con law professor hat and say what was at stake was what the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle underlying all of First Amendment law, viewpoint neutrality. The government must remain neutral with respect to the viewpoint, the idea, the message, the content of the speech. If you hate it, then refute it, ignore it, answer it back, but don't call on the government to censor it. So in the courts of law, it was an easy case, but in the court of public opinion, it was very difficult. And you see that same dichotomy today, where the Supreme Court, despite all of the differences among the justices on many hot-button issues, by and large are unanimous or almost unanimous in upholding freedom for the most unpopular speech that public opinion polls show many, many Americans believe should be censored. Hate speech, pornography, extremist speech, the list could go on and on. And so REA's book, I thought, was a wonderful, persuasive, compelling explanation for why, especially those of us who are promoting human rights and seeking to counter hatred and fascism, why we have an especially big stake in defending freedom of speech, counterintuitive as that is. So I think that's one of the reasons why, Greg, it's an eternally radical idea, because it's not so obvious that defending free speech for Nazis is ultimately the best safety mechanism for Jews and other minority members. But when you read REA's book, and I hope when you read our book as well, you will come to understand that. But it's hard to explain as soundbite. And I think that's why we tried to be as brief as we could.
This is one of the points that I'm actually going to get into with you in a second, but That's what you alluded to briefly was what I wanted to ask you about, Skokie. As somebody who got into leadership of the ACLU afterwards, but you were involved from the outskirts during the time. You got to see different stages of the institution as it relates to this event, which is possibly one of the most radical affairs that it was involved in, and one of the most radical statements that it has made about its positions. And you could argue that it has drifted away from some of that over time. But you're also saying that even in real time, there was at least 13% of dissent about the decision to get involved in this. So can you tell us a bit about the different attitudes from inside the institution regarding Skokie and regarding the ACLU's understanding of its responsibility towards this very expansive definition of free speech?
Well, the ACLU is a very large, contentious organization, which includes not only a national level of the organization, but each state has at least one, what we call affiliate, which have a certain amount of autonomy from the national organization. And throughout my long history at the ACLU, I can hardly remember an issue where there wasn't fierce debate and some dissent, even amongst committed civil libertarians. However, and so what I want to say is at the national level of the organization, there continues to be the strongest support for the very same viewpoint neutrality principle as a matter of law that was at issue in the Skokie case, and also the importance of the ACLU in particular standing up for that. Almost exactly 50 years later, the National ACLU did exactly the same thing. It's well known in some circles, but not nearly as well known as the Skokie case is for some reason. In Charlottesville in 2017, the Skokie case was in 1977. The ACLU was the organization, it actually was the ACLU's Virginia affiliate, was the organization that defended the free speech rights of the Unite the Right white supremacists who were gathering in Charlottesville to protest the removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee. Now, in fairness, we had absolutely no idea. There was no evidence. The judge found that there was no evidence of any planned violence. And in fact, the police chief in Charlottesville testified that they had no evidence of plans for violence. And if there was violence, that they were well prepared to avert any actual harm to human beings. Conversely, members of the city council testified that they were seeking to withdraw the demonstration permit that they had granted to Unite the Right because of the odiousness of their ideas. A straightforward violation of the viewpoint neutrality principle. So I'm very proud that the ACLU took that stance, that the judge upheld it. And I have to tell you, we have gotten such a huge amount of blowback. Very often when I speak, people accuse me and the ACLU of being responsible for the murder of Heather Heyer, the counter demonstrator who was tragically killed. I don't want to go too far down that road, but just to say the ACLU continues to take a hit for that kind of representation. Let me give you an even more recent example.
A hit from inside as well as from outside.
Oh, yes. Well, in this case, we didn't have the membership resignations that we had in the Skokie situation. I don't understand why that is. I don't know why that is. But we did have an enormous amount of pushback from some leaders, including a board member of the board of the ACLU of Virginia affiliate, which had directly handled the case, publicly tendered his resignation and denounced the ACLU's position in an op-ed in the New York Times. And a number of younger staff lawyers for ACLU affiliates around the country objected and asked that the ACLU re-examine its position on these issues. And I point out out the younger factor because it's a pattern that I've seen in other institutions that traditionally have been committed to free speech, that the younger members of those organizations are the ones that are challenging that traditional speech protected position. We started seeing that first in academia, then in journalism, in publishing, among librarians, and now even among civil liberties organizations. So I continue to be very proud of the ACLU's work, and its adherence to these classic principles, but we can't take for granted the continuing support even among people who see themselves as civil libertarians, which is why Greg and I continue to write and advocate and educate.
This actually segues perfectly to my next question. The reason Skokie stands out to me as a historical icon, because it really shows, as Greg put it, that they really believe it, right? It takes an ideal, shakes you up from the sense of dormant cliches and makes you realize that this is a living principle that gets tested over time. And when it does get tested, it can look ugly and messy, but it means something.
I want to say one other thing, and then I'd love to hear more from Greg. Adaam ties into the universities and the law firms now that are saying that they're facing, and I think with great credibility, that they're facing existential threats from the administration. That's the reason that was given by the head of Paul Weiss as to why they decided to.
Paul Weiss being a major law firm that has been targeted by the Trump administration, have had some of their access permits rescinded.
You're making their ongoing practice very, very fragile, and so they really felt that they would go out of existence if they didn't compromise or agree to some of the Trump administration's demands.
Basically being very underhandedly and very openly bullied by the Trump administration, forcing them to commit to take more conservative causes as part of their pro bono work, I believe.
Yes, to even represent the Trump administration. The ACLU definitely was facing an existential crisis as a result of the Skokie representation and the hemorrhaging of members and donors. And I know that because even when I became active at the National ACLU, which was 5 years later, we were still facing budgetary repercussions as a result of that. And there had been enormous staff cutbacks and programmatic cutbacks. And, a decision was made by Aria, the CEO, and other national leaders that this was a price worth paying to stand up for principle. And we earned the respect. Many of the people who had quit rejoined, and many others who had never been members in the first place joined with letters saying things like, you really are neutral and principled, and so now I am going to join.
Sorry, now I have to ask you about this for another second before going to my next question. What you in contrast, Paul Weiss and some other law firms had to cave, and Paul Weiss is not, it doesn't stand in the same place as the ACLU. It is a business first and foremost, unlike the ACLU, which is a nonprofit. But there have been certainly many institutions that we've seen over the past 20 years that have caved to both internal and external pressures to bend their principles, especially when it comes to things like free speech. We've seen these examples from the left and the right. The populist demand that an institution shows loyalty to a cause over commitment to higher principles like free speech have made many places become less and less liberal over the years. And those threats are both monetary and a matter of clout and prestige, reputation. What allows an institution to have the backbone to stand for it? Because it's not just a matter of, you have the single leader who says, we are going to stick to our guns. It has to be something else that allows or creates the incentive for some institutions to stand firm while others feel the need to change and cave. How, and this is a question to both of you. I'm interested if you have any thoughts, Greg.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think about this all the time. I mean, one of the things when I started, when I took over for David French at FIRE, and I actually was legal director long before David French was president. And I was one of the people who wanted to be president because he's a friend. And I like the idea of someone who's more left-leaning like me and someone who's more right-leaning like David being at the head of the organization, just like our two founders. One was more left-leaning, one's more right-leaning. We always thought that was very healthy for us. But I remember when I started, a conservative wrote me thinking they were writing David, saying, is this ACLU liberal atheist going to care about me? And it really touched my heart. Like it was one of those things where I was like, oh my God, of course I'm going to, but I have to prove that. And I got really interested in like how you keep from fighting what's sometimes called the curse of O'Sullivan. Sometimes this is Robert Conquest's idea. Sometimes I attribute to him, but this idea that any organization that is not explicitly conservative eventually becomes leftist. And I want FIRE to be the organization that doesn't become that. And we've thought a lot about ways to sort of prevent, to keep us sort of ideologically strong, and committed and principled. And so one thing that we do is that we make sure that we have a lot of political diversity among our staff. And it's nice to actually see, some of our more like left-leaning employees actually really embody that, to be kind of like, I want a conservative in the room to bounce this off of because I want to make sure that I'm not being an idiot on this. And so it has to become part of the culture. We think it helps to only have one practice area at FIRE. Like we're just freedom of speech. We don't have the tensions that the ACLU has where it's, the different 17 or 19 different practice areas are kind of, like they understandably have their own interests. We don't, we know also that we can't kind of like throw clients under the bus, like to be kind of like, in the sense of being kind of like, my client here, while a total asshole, well, of course we'd have total freedom to do that. It also is very hard to remain nonpartisan under those circumstances. So that's how we try to keep the culture within the organization, ideologically, nonpartisan. But as far as funding, a model like that, it's hard. And I knew 15 years ago that if I wanted to be rich, like if I wanted to have like a $100 million nonprofit, I could have done this 15 years ago by leaning. I could have chosen hard left or hard right. But you have to choose one or the other if you want to rake in the money kind of like as fast as possible. We went the much harder.
Totally different in media.
Yeah, exactly. We went the much harder way, which was to piss everybody off to a degree and actually play it right down the middle, call balls and strikes as clearly as possible. And that's not, I actually had a donor with a great deal of respect say, it's a pretty bad business model you got there, Greg. Because like if your interest is raising money, he's right. It is hard right now because a lot of people who love me because I don't like wokeness, and I don't like woke censorship. But then they shouldn't be surprised that, by the way, that which could also be described as left authoritarianism. I also hate right authoritarianism, and institutionally, of course we do. And I think there was a period in American history where that was much more respected, like the idea of being that group that calls balls and strikes and is genuinely principled was something that was an easier sell. Right now, the culture war is so vicious and so intense that essentially we get this question that's basically, are you with us or against us? So right now, like people who thought wokeness was the worst thing in the world are mad at us because we're taking on the Trump administration like every hour, we're currently in court with not just Trump administration, but Trump himself on a case where he's suing a pollster for getting a poll wrong. It's a crazy case involving Ann Seltzer and the Des Moines Register. And
I'm sure the accusations is not going to be why is Trump taking all these crazy cases, but was why are you obsessed with Trump so much, right?
Exactly. And right now we're getting blasted, from both sides. So honestly, a part of it also you have to get the muscle memory of walking away from donors and being willing to anger friends. And thankfully, I've had a lot of experience with this. Fire's had a lot. I mean, so my first cases were actually right after 9/11. And believe me, I had to defend a lot of not so sympathetic, I was born in New York City. So obviously, my heart was with New York. But, I defended a lot of unsympathetic person from the very first minutes, literally, of my career. But you have to develop that. And if you're headed by someone who's primarily a fundraiser for a lot of these smaller nonprofits, it's kind of like they see the existential threat, that doing something really unpopular early on would have. But when Fire faced that in our early days, we developed the secret motto of Fire, which is we are willing to drive this bus into a wall rather than be unprincipled. But that's a hard ethos to establish in any organization, and getting that in a law firm. Although I will say, I know a lot of people who work at some of these law firms, particularly the older ones, and they're like the old boss never would have given into this just on principle. They would have been like, no way am I gonna just bend the knee to the president on this.
But again, that's an age difference, which is exactly what Nadine was pointing to, that there's a new generation that is either more susceptible to tribal ideological arguments or has less of a classical liberal backbone, so they don't know what they're compromising by giving in.
Adaam, this is such a profound question, and I love Craig's answer. And I've got, thinking my experience is most directly with the ACLU. And, yesterday, another journalist asked me a question about lessons from history. Have in civil society institutions had more fortitude against similar pressures in the past? And again, my knowledge is only of the ACLU. This is way before my time, but I was steeped in the history and the embarrassment of the more modern ACLU about how the ACLU did succumb to pressure during the McCarthy period, during the Cold War. And it has apologized about not sufficiently standing up for the free speech rights and the academic freedom rights and the due process rights of people who are accused of being communists. And we've and even kicked an active member of the Communist Party off the national board of directors of the ACLU. And so, and that led to some new organizations being founded because they were trying to do what the ACLU was supposed to do, but had abandoned. And I don't know what explains. I do know that there were forces within the organization at that time that were arguing very, very strongly for more active engagement and more backbone. Why it is that they lost out, who knows? I think it probably does come down to a matter of personalities and leadership.
I do have a question here, though, and I've wondered about this. There seems to be a lot of hand-wringing about kicking out Elizabeth Gurley Flynn in the 1950s, and she was head of the Communist Party during the time when they had to pretend Hitler wasn't so bad because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and she was a full-on Stalinist. I mean, if I found out someone on my staff was yeah, totalitarian's okay, I'm like, are you sure you should be in the civil liberties organization? Anyway, sorry. I just always wondered about that one.
You literally asked my question. Yes.
Yeah. I had some of those questions too. And I think the hand-wringing is because the ACLU, for better or worse, had a policy that it would not reject people regardless of what organizations they belong to in other capacities. We may question whether that was the right policy, but, it was part of a pattern of ignoring whatever the policies were, including classic civil liberties principles.
But this is actually beautiful, because then when the ACLU does decide to push her out, it means that this is the ACLU. You can argue that this is the ACLU making a needed correction of maybe having a principle that is unfeasible if you're truly trying to protect a liberal standard for society. Because if you have a Stalin, and you can take that both in the ACLU or as a metaphor to America, which is the problem is when you're trying to defend a liberal system, a classically liberal system, there is a point where you need to draw a line about totalitarianism. And if you're having a totalitarian, a Trojan horse, what do you do about this? Do you just say, as part of my commitment to liberalism, I'm going to accept this Trojan horse present?
And of course, that means you don't arrest them. You have the right to think, and we are, and fire absolutely defends this.
You can be totalitarian and the freedom of your own home.
Yeah,
and in the town square, you can be totalitarian in the town square.
Pro-Nazi or pro-Stalin or like whatever. You should not be arrested, for any of this kind of stuff. You should not be fined for this kind of stuff. But on this question, kind of like, for me, like I run a civil liberties organization, I run a freedom of speech organization, and if someone in my staff raised their hand and said, "But I think a lot of books should be banned if they don't agree with like the following 15 things," and I'm like, maybe you shouldn't work here.
Well, I don't disagree. I think this is getting a little bit further afield from the central question of how do you resist what everybody understands to be, or the broad consensus within an institution is that this is inconsistent with what our mission is, whether it be as a law firm, whether it be as a university, and or even if some of the pressure is directed toward goals that are consistent with academic freedom and free speech, to use the universities as an example. Is this the wrong way to go about it, by succumbing to a list of demands from the executive branch?
And this is a funny moment for FIRE too, in some ways, because like we have a campus free speech ranking, that's extremely intensive. Like there's the largest survey of student opinion ever done, plus the largest database of professor cancellations, student cancellations, deplatforming, and speech codes. And when we put it all into a big old, algorithm that actually a Harvard a statistician helped us work on, Harvard came out dead last. But right now, how much time we are spending explaining, no, Trump administration, just because, Harvard might be guilty of a lot of sins here, it doesn't mean you can magically make up powers to effectively nationalize a private university. So that's one of the ones where I have some sympathy for some of the donors who are mad at us about this, is it can feel a little bit like whiplash, essentially being kind of like, well, I thought you said these guys were the bad guys. I'm like, but the bad, whether I wouldn't put it that way, but the bad guys still have rights.
But Greg, I actually think that this is a point that is more easily defended, if a bit uncomfortably, because you can say that the laws are the laws, and the system, and we are also respecting the system.
Damn straight.
And the fact that there's a problem in Harvard that we were. You can argue we were literally the first to point out, doesn't mean that these are the tools to solve them.
Exactly.
And this is, I think, generally an argument when you have a problem with free speech. Like you can argue that I'm Israeli, so I'm very mindful of the pro-Gaza protests. You can argue that the protests are a problem. Doesn't mean that the way to solve them is to start deporting their members, right? And the fact that this is the only solution, the easiest, most available solution that you have right now, doesn't mean that this is a trigger you should pull. That does not make it right. So I think this is actually an easy point to defend. I think that what Nadine, what you said before, is actually the trickier issue, because when we were talking about internally in institutions, that's where theoretically you have more discretion. This is not about the federal government coming in ham-fistedly trying to just eliminate problems from existence, but this is about the discretion of an institution to call out its own members. And because you said that this is us going a bit farther afield, but I'm not so sure about this. Because if you're looking at some of the causes for consternation for the liberal cause, let's say, for the classical liberal cause over the past 20 years, a lot of them are the result of drift in institutions like legacy media and elite education. And the reason you got that drift was because of increasing tolerance to totalitarian viewpoints in the House. So these are institutions that get to play a sort of their version of the classic, clown nose on, clown nose off, but with liberalism. We're for free speech when it's the Gaza protests, but we suddenly are very pro hate speech regulation when it comes to right-wing speakers. That becomes a problem. And this is a problem that it gets even more challenging to resolve the more the organization changes its internal makeup and becomes less focused on a genuine commitment to free speech, civil liberties, and liberalism, and instead turns into a more ideologically bent, propaganda machine.
That's a fair point. I'm sorry, when I said we're going further afield, I thought we were still talking about Elizabeth Curley Flynn back, about almost 100 years ago. But you make a very fair point. And I think the biggest challenge that an organization like the ACLU faces comes from a very significant point that Greg alluded to, that it is a multi-issue organization. And so people, the vast majority of staff members of the organization are hired to work on issues that have nothing directly to do with free speech. They're hired for a project that focuses on LGBTQ rights or on the racial justice or on voting rights, et cetera, et cetera. And what that means is the staff members who focus on free speech issues are excellent and continue to take excellent positions, but they face some blowback from others in the organization who aren't as necessarily as supportive. And let me just mention one recent example, because I have, no problem critiquing the ACLU about this. It was a Skokie type situation from some people's perspectives because our client was as deeply unpopular with many people on the left as the Nazis are, namely the NRA, the National Rifle Association. And the National ACLU, to its credit, successfully represented the NRA in the Supreme Court in a very important case that we won, which ironically is now being cited left, right, and center in every challenge to Trump administration.
Especially left.
Yeah. Trump administration pressure against universities and law firms, because the holding is that government may neither directly or indirectly coerce or influence a violation of free speech rights. That was so unpopular among not only so many ACLU members, but also a couple of our state-based affiliates actually absented themselves and said, we're dissociating from the ACLU's representation of the NRA. And one of those affiliates was our New York affiliate. And the case was from New York. It was a New York government official under the Cuomo administration who was putting pressure on banks and financial insurance companies not to do business with the NRA. And,
I didn't even remember that.
Yes, the NYCLU, the leadership, the members decided that that was so antithetical to their values, even though, our national legal director pointed out, but wait, if the Cuomo administration can do this to NRA, the DeSantis administration can do it to Planned Parenthood or the ACLU itself.
Or the ACLU,
And now the Trump administration is doing it to everybody. So, we continue to face those pressures within the organization. I'm not embarrassed about it. I think it shows that even for people who self-identify as civil libertarians, we can't take for granted that they will see eye to eye on these issues. And I'm open-minded and self-questioning enough that I say, and we should always question even our strongest beliefs, right? So every time we're challenged within or without the organization, it's an opportunity to ask, well, maybe they're right. So far, I haven't been persuaded, but, that gives an opportunity to say, Adaam, I sincerely take all of those questions very seriously. When Greg and I started doing the series of blog posts, I think, Greg, you called them the 10 worst arguments. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to say like the 10 most important arguments.
Call them 10 bad arguments.
The 10 most common arguments. But I know you.
To be fair, when you say 10 worst argument, it does sound like you're straw manning. Like, let me take the easy way out, which is
And I honestly, I'm not sure I gave the correct subtitle of the book. I don't have it in front of me. But yeah, what they are, I think they are, some of them are very strong and do require a lot of thinking and a lot of explanation.
And I'm just grumpier.
I think this is just a side thought, but this is a conversation that I had with many people over the past 6 years, specifically actually with David French, as well as with Sarah Isier, who I work with. But I've asked a lot of people people who have specifically faced some kind of rejection from their own crowd or their own team and have found themselves alone in their supposed tribe or institution. For a lot of people facing this situation, the appeal of then going 180 and either joining another team or capitulating is high. And I think joining the other team or capitulating, in both cases, you are giving up on the sharpness of your commitment to, especially when we're talking about liberal values. There are a few people who have managed to face this situation and emerge still committed to liberalism on the other end. And I ask people, what do they think makes that difference? I asked earlier about the institutions, what allows institutions to remain steadfast, and now I'm basically bringing up the question of what makes an individual maintain their commitments. And just listening to you speak, Nadine, and the sort of confidence that you express in facing dissent adds credence to my guess that it is a lot about just a natural temperament. And there's a certain temperament that allows you to face rejection, dissent, and almost a threat of ostracism with a sense of, of course, some degree of fear, but mostly as an opportunity for a stronger fight. And it almost gives you spirit as opposed to makes you cower and seek a new tribe to hide in. So it's just listening to you describe this was in itself inspiring. I mean, at least for me. But I did want to ask a question about going back all the way to Skokie. The reason that Skokie was inspiring for me was that idealization of the commitment. The reason you were writing the book is because clearly a lot of Americans no longer see this kind of idealized principle stand as inspiring anymore. Some part of this is a loss of faith in the American experiment, isn't it? Because people like me read the Declaration of Independence, and it still provokes them because there really is something that is epoch-breaking, history-breaking. It's just thrilling. It's history. I mean, because my field of study is history. So for me to encounter this piece and see that you're thinking about a million years of human history, and then you get to a point where a group of people go to war and make this declaration. It's touching. And then to see, the Gettysburg Address or Lincoln's second inauguration, you read those statements of reinterpreting the Declaration of Independence, not just as theoretical ideals, but not as academic discoursations, but as something that justifies blood and sacrifice. It is impossible to comprehend, I think, for most human beings in our past. It is almost utopian in how unlikely this vision is. And I think this is something that is a story that not many nations have. And this is why so many new democracies still look to this model for storytelling in order to develop their own myth of democracy and create a sense of patriotism and inspiration. They still use the language of 18th century American founding. And yet, Americans seem to need to have a book explaining to them why free speech is good, actually. What do you make of this?
Well, I don't know how widespread. Well, let me say this. If you ask questions at an abstract level, do you believe in free speech? Are you inspired by the Declaration of Independence? The answers are overwhelmingly positive. The problem is only, quote unquote, when it comes to particularly controversial exercises of the rights that are supported in the abstract. And certainly throughout my entire adult lifetime, which has been very long now to you two young men, that hasn't changed at all. And it hasn't changed in terms of public opinion surveys. You know, in what I remember when we had the big in 1976, the 200-year anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, many surveys were done about people's attitude toward not only the Declaration, but the Bill of Rights. And I remember that overwhelming majorities of the public said, we believe in free speech. And then you would ask specific questions. And then the concerns were more about like national security or crime. Well, what do you think about speech that could cause a crime? Oh, no. Oh, what do you think about speech that might undermine national security? Oh, no. And they held those no votes to be completely consistent with their misunderstanding, if I do say so, of free speech. And I think that's why, this goes back to an earlier theme in our wonderful conversation, that is always going to be a relatively small group of people who just keep the eye fixed on the abstract ideal, no matter what the particular facts are, no matter what the particular ideologies are, that call for an enforcement of that ideal or respect of that ideal in a particular situation.
Yeah, I mean, I worry about it from an educational standpoint. I do think that there was kind of an overcorrection in terms of the way we view America and American history, that it went from sort of a narcissism of it being, the greatest and only and most important and most perfect country of all time, which was a narcissism that I remember a little bit as a kid, to a narcissism of everything's our fault. And I've kind of watched that happen over my own lifetime. And I think both are foolish, in different ways. But I do think that it's kind of like when people talk about American exceptionalism, like contemptuously. It's one of those things where I'm kind of like, listen, take positive or negative out of exceptionalism. Like, I'm not like, don't interpret it as greatest. If you simply mean historically weird and important, there's no question that the oldest, continuous democracy in human history, is important. There's no question that for that matter, defeat of the British Empire was something really important that happened. That the largest economy of the 20th century, the country that won World War I, and helped win World War II, there's a lot to be proud of. There's a lot to be critical of. But I do think that when you look at polling, particularly for younger people, like their view of the founding is really kind of depressing. And sometimes when people just kind of assume that my entire sort of perspective on on the Republic, is essentially like really negative since I, fight the government. I'm kind of like, I don't know. Like, I think there's nothing more patriotic than a constitutional lawyer. We're trying to uphold the best values of this crazy idea country, So I worry a little bit that we've overcorrected to a degree where we have to be either ones or zeros, and that essentially we've gone too much in the, direction of there's kind of nothing special or nothing to love about this country. And I think that a lot of us who care about the Constitution beg to differ.
I feel like Trump is perfectly within trend personally, but it's funny. I teach a class in a college course in political sociology, and in every test I ask the same question: and what is my greatest enemy? What is Adaam's greatest enemy? And my enemy is cliches. Which at some point I will give extra credit to the student who points out the irony of this question showing up in every single test, but. But cliches are interesting. They make conversations worse and they make social thinking worse, but they are historically fascinating because they tell you a lot about the society in terms of understanding which ideas got ossified and retransmitted. The fact that we are now at the point where, not now, for the past 30 years, we're at the point where saying, oh, I'm sorry, I thought this is America, was said ironically because you take for granted that you live in the country that has civil liberty protections, right? Or the free speech protections, is phenomenal. Like what? I can't think of this example throughout history where you've reached the point of taking civil liberties so much for granted that you can say, oh, I'm sorry, I thought this is America. Ironically, taking that as the baseline of the human condition of having your speech, your associations, your activity protected by the government as a default. It is fascinating. Can I keep you a little longer because I wanted to ask you about pure information theory?
Sure.
Because I know that we are at the cusp, but I mean, like I said, I'd be optimistic to get to half of the questions I wanted to ask. One of the parts in the books that I found myself aggressively note-taking started with your own treatment of cliches. You had a chapter dealing with two tropes in free speech, antagonistic polemics, which is the fire in a burning theater, yelling fire at a burning theater, and the marketplace of ideas. I would have loved to get to both of them, but I don't want to strain your time, so I'll leave people to, if you are, as a listener, if you still, we've already condemned that phrase multiple times on this podcast. So if you still are inclined to use the phrase, bully to you. But with the marketplace of ideas, you specifically focused on whether or not the marketplace of ideas is a good justification for expansive freedom of speech. The general understanding of the marketplace of ideas is, or I should say the shallow understanding of the marketplace of ideas is that ideas pitted against each other in, a capitalistic free-for-all will end up leading to the best market results, which is the best proxy we have for truth. A corollary cliche is sunlight is the best disinfectant. All of these make the assumption that, the best solution for bad ideas is good ideas or stuff like that. All of these are cliches that assume that having more information will ultimately lead to the calling out of bad ideas, and therefore the best, most moral, most progressive, and most accurate stories will emerge, or will be the only ones to be able to survive the scrutiny. There's some good in this, there's some bad in this, and we're not going to go deep. But Greg did offer his counter argument, saying that the marketplace of ideas is at very best a lacking description, a lacking justification for maintaining a free speech regime. And in contrast, you're proposing looking at this more as what you call the pure information theory as a justification. So can you explain that rationale and then let me push back a little?
Sure. The marketplace of ideas idea, and it's something that it's kind of borrowing from John Stuart Mill. It was referred to by Oliver Wendell Holmes, and really ultimately it was Douglas who put it exactly that way. And what's funny is it's most rejected in the place where it's the most accurate, which is higher ed. Higher ed is actually supposed to be a marketplace of ideas, and they're the most contemptuous of it. And I find that funny. But to me, the marketplace of ideas is not...
At least they still produce good irony.
Yeah, yes. Is not wrong as much as it's incomplete. I think that there's a like, if you look at the big Boolean sphere of freedom of speech, for one thing, truth finding, is a tiny bit of what we usually use our expression to look into, and that essentially, like, we're it's a sub part of even that argument. So I don't think it's complete. My sort of pure informational theory is that everything about humanity is worth knowing, and this is not something I say as an argument. This is something I think is a fact, that everything about every human being, every living thing, I think the universe is worth understanding. And the idea that you can have even the slightest clue about what the universe looks like with people pretending falsifying their opinions on what they actually believe or think or understand is silly. and this is where the grumpiness comes in out. One of the most important facts about the world is knowing what people really think, full stop. And of course, that includes misconceptions. Most of what we believe will be proved, or at least is incomplete, or is a misconception about something. We're constantly being taught time and time again. So everything about humanity is worth knowing. That includes our misconceptions. In fact, misconceptions change the world. So the idea that you can actually understand the world without having an environment where people are actually being their authentic selves is, to me, ridiculous.
I think it's poetically very compelling.
Mm-hmm.
I want to say poetically, I mean in the most positive way. I feel like Americans use poetically as a way to dismiss the meat of an argument.
Both my parents are European, and I think, and also some Americans like poetry.
I think so, but they would still use the word disparagingly. And the Skokie case had more impact, I think, poetically than it necessarily did politically. So I think that the way you describe, and you have more words to it in your essay in the book and in your blog. So I think listeners should go and explore this idea, because I think it makes a very strong case, or a very compelling case for what is human striving? Why do we write? Why do we seek history? Why do we learn? My little pushback is you don't dismiss the factor of truth seeking, but you use the pure information theory to diminish its role in the liberal project.
I disagree.
Oh, I read it as trying to explain why the marketplace of ideas as a competitive system to get to truth is problematic, because truth itself is not our goal. Our goal is, or ought to be, the collection of information. And one of the arguments that you've made is, people have bad ideas, and this is a quote, "It's useful to know whether paranoid delusions are prominent within a population." Another example you said is, we study history even though we know that most of the ideas that they believed in the past are false.
But that's truth. That's a kind of truth.
Well, okay, so that was my point, that all of this is truth value.
Yeah.
History is a study of truth. This is the differentiation between studying history and reading fiction, right?
Yeah.
So this is still a system of evaluating truth, it is still a system of collecting truth, but without a strong method for evaluating truth. We're losing the distinction between whether we're studying history or just reading fiction, or whether we are taking tabs on people's delusion in society, as opposed to just partaking in those delusions, right? So truth seeking and truth sifting is crucial for this to work, right?
Sure.
So my soft criticism is that I see the liberal project as, I shouldn't say I see, I've increasingly started seeing the liberal project as focused on truth, and everything else as being a heuristic or a tool or a method for better processing of truth. I mean, free speech has its beauty on its own, because, I think, Nadine, in your listing of causes, you've pointed out personal autonomy and self-actualization and other aspects that are more about the value of the individual. But I think without commitment to truth as the ideal, there is a problem. There is a gaping hole in all of this, including in the information and in the pure information, because pure information without ability to evaluate truth is chaos.
Well, let me tell you, Adaam, how I understood Greg's pure information theory, which I completely agree with. And I have to say, without having had that elegant term, people will often say to me, because I wrote a whole book about hate speech, there's no value in hearing hate speech. And my first answer is always, if the person has a hateful idea, I want to know it. There's value in knowing that. But I understand Greg's point to be not instead of the marketplace of ideas justification, but in addition to it.
Yes. It's the marketplace of ideas is not wrong. It's incomplete.
No, of course. It was clear in my original question. I didn't say that you said it's wrong. It's that it's lacking. But all this is to say, when we defend free speech and we defend free speech against the arguments about disinformation, right? But disinformation, misinformation, and the total chaos of the dissemination of information that we have now in the social media age that is creating not just some readily available information as in a few books written by a few cranks, but we can hear the voices of every single crank in the human verse right now on Twitter. Is it possible that this is more information than we are currently able to sift effectively in a way that actually ends up reaching the juice that we're trying to squeeze out of it, which is truth, right? Are we potentially reaching a point where there's so much information that we are at sea and that misses the liberal project?
My answer to that question, it goes back to the marketplace of ideas rationale. No proponent of that, to my knowledge, no proponent of that justification for free speech has ever maintained that it will ultimately lead to truth.
I didn't say that. I said that that's the wrong representation of the marketplace of ideas. That's not my view.
Okay, because the relevant question is not, are we going to arrive at truth? Can we sufficiently sift out all of the massive disinformation that we're now confronting? But what is the lesser of two imperfect approaches? As compared to what? As compared to having a centralized government authority do the sifting for us? No.
I agree. The reason I'm going to push back is just because I want to hear your response to the best version of my argument, which is that I completely agree that the marketplace of ideas as just, get to truth through Darwinism is false. And it was never the idea of being the marketplace of ideas. I totally... That's what I'm saying, that Greg, in challenging that idea, I think went a step further and may have skipped the importance of truth seeking. My point isn't that marketplace of ideas is a better solution. My suggestion is that we do not have the mechanism for truth sifting at this point. And by that, lacking that pure information with the volume of information that we have right now, without the sort of sedulous audacity for truth seeking that comes with the original 19th century liberal project, which I think is what you're reflecting. You're reflecting 19th century liberal project. We want to get all the information and catalog it and organize it and get to the truth of the human nature by knowing all of it. But back then, the information was narrow. Information was limited. Now we have social media. And I wonder what it means if we still apply those liberal values without having the tools, without offering or at least engaging with the question of what are the tools to sift truth.
Yeah. So we passed the ability for a single human mind to sift through truth, probably, 500 BC, or maybe 200, there was just too much for a single human mind to know. So we've had to develop systems that allow us to better understand it. And one of the reasons, so I did a speech that I called Fight the Guardians, because I'm pretty hard on Plato. A lot of the stuff that I'm fighting is this particularly a tendency among the intellectuals, or people who think they're intellectuals, is to have an idea of truth as being just like Plato had, and I believe he actually thought this, that there's a solid, perfect form of truth, beauty, squareness that actually exists somewhere in some other dimension, and that to me is an overly simplistic way to look at reality, and unfortunately, it appeals to. But whether or not he actually thought that, I think that a lot of people tend to see truth as mostly focusing on objective fact of the world, and it tends not to include things like what humans really think, why they really think it, all of these kind of things. So a lot of times when people are talking about marketplace of ideas, a lot of times they're talking about maybe the best proposal for fixing this problem win. Whereas I want them to have a much more expansive view. Now, if you're getting to the idea of information processing, like I said, it's past the individual human being's ability to actually process all of it. ages ago were actually not even individually all that good at it. We came up with systems for processing information. And that's one of the reasons why, and I talk a lot about these, and I want my next book actually to be a lot about this from a neuroscience perspective. I've actually been calling it the neuroscience of knowing. I even know who I want to write it with. But about, defending things like scientific method, defending things like the systems we actually use for processing information and figuring out what. And what's interesting is we don't actually figure out what's true. We figure out what's false. And this is one of the ways in which, some of the sophists who argue about this stuff are to some degree right. They're saying, well, we can't know what objective truth is. Yes, but we can know what it's not. And then you start actually sort of targeting it on truth.
That's why falsification is a critical standard of...
I'm a huge fan of Charles Sanders Peirce.
And Popper.
And Popper, of course. Love these guys. Love the epistemologists, critically, who believe that we're, fallible.
And you're reminding me, Greg, there are so many words and ideas in your contributions to our book that I really enjoyed rereading. But one of them was, after you referred to the Enlightenment, you had a parenthetical in which you said, which was actually a discovery of how little we know.
Yeah. That was something actually I read, and I don't think it's actually Harari's term, but actually people say it's Kant's, that we should have called the Enlightenment the discovery of our ignorance, because that really was more what it was, essentially discovering how little we know. So when it comes to, do we currently have too much information for us to handle? I actually think at this moment, we might be at a tipping point for how much information we can handle, thanks to things like AI and our processing ability. I think that actually the idea that there's a limit to what we could actually know or understand, I think we just massively expanded our potential to get things right, as well as horribly, horribly wrong, of course, is also a very real possibility. But that's one of the reasons why we can't give up on the vastness of what we actually need to know, instead of having this kind of idea that we must know the simple truth about the nature of reality, that basically means that, and therefore the fact that someone actually believes a misconception is somehow not worthwhile, which is something that I see kind of primitively argued on campus a lot, that essentially that there's no value in falsity. It's actually, counterfactuals, devil's advocacy, thought experimentation. These are actually also incredibly valuable things.
Right. I think all of this is profound. And like I said, I recommend everybody read this argument. I was trying to take the next step of that conclusion. And I think it's actually telling that what you said just now is that we're at the tipping point of our capacity for processing, partly because of AI.
Yeah.
But we don't know what AI actually means to our ability to process information as a society. It might take us past point of where all this discussion that is reliant on 18th century liberalism and 19th century desire for knowledge completely moot, right? It's like our entire new norms of information and truth seeking and society building could be changing.
Okay, this is a surprising segue, but it almost seems like we set this up. But obviously, if we're being this long-winded, we weren't setting anything up. But the FIRE and the Cosmos Institute are helping fund a prize for people who develop AI with a greater focus on things like intellectual humility, with a greater focus of promoting freedom of speech, something that actually is more of a facilitator as opposed to of truth-seeking and optimized for truth-seeking. So, and the Cosmos Institute is a really cool group. We work with this guy, Brendan McCord, an entrepreneur, and we're trying to actually make sure that of the two different possibilities, and for AI, one, that's sometimes called dystopia, is really more fear of it becoming a tool for tyranny. And of course, as a civil person, this is the scenario that Nadine and I are the most afraid of. And then, of course, the other one is chaos, which, having a libertarian bent, I'm a little bit more, chaos sounds a lot more fun. But I get that could also be terrifying in its own way. And we do actually think that there are ways that you can have AI that actually promotes truth seeking, that actually does show some of that could actually facilitate this if it's designed with that end in mind.
I'm on the camp that sees chaos or lawlessness as a form of totalitarian tyranny, because in lawlessness, it is power that gets to just impose their will on others. That's the resultant corollary of chaos as far as I see it, but we'll leave it to another time.
So some amount of chaos is fun.
You want some chaos in the bloodstream for sure. You want some arbitrariness. Nadine, any thoughts of this before we wrap up? Because there's too much Greg and Adaam back and forth.
Oh, no. I was absolutely fascinated. You two are operating at a much more sophisticated historical and philosophical level. I'm much more focused on law and activism. And so I keep coming back to the perspective of, free speech and all of the problems that you've raised in terms of its truth-seeking potential, information processing potential, and the limitations. I will readily acknowledge, but I continue to adhere to the as compared to what. I agree that chaos may be as ultimately freedom restricting as government overreach. But I think what is being proposed now is government overreach to stave off feared chaos. And that is definitely, we may not reach truth through freedom of information and freedom of speech, but we are certainly not going to reach it through some top-down control. And by that, I mean whether it's coming from the top of tech titans who are dominating our information platforms, or whether it's coming from the top of government. That is a guarantee that we will not find truth.
And that's ultimately the I think Thomas Sowell said the tragic vision that things have trade-offs, right? You're not really dealing with choosing the best possible, but against what? You guys have been wonderful. I am regretful of all the hours of conversation that I didn't get to bring up. Let me just ask you our capper question. This is just a quick one. Our standard uncertain things closer. If you could each give me what you think is the greatest blind spot on the left and the right in American politics right now. And you can't just say that they don't truly believe in free speech, because that's a given.
Wow. I have to tell the audience we weren't told in advance what this question would be. I'm sorry, I didn't listen to the end of other podcasts, so I didn't hear it.
I would argue that our current civilization, only 0.01% of the population listens to the end of podcasts in general. So,
now I'm not stalling for time. I'm not going to make. I think the same problem pertains to both of them, but it probably pertains just to cognitive biases that all of us human beings are subject to, that we tend to demonize whoever the other is, that we see the world in oversimplistic binaries rather than nuances and shades of gray, and are not sufficiently self-critical.
And for me, it comes back to the theme that we opened this up with. I would love to get people to stop referring to the left as liberal, because liberalism is a bigger, more interesting idea than just left. We might say progressivism. Thankfully, a lot of people on the left at different points in history have been liberal, but like the larger liberal project is such a compelling idea, and it's something that I feel like is lost on the sort of the more sort of classically social justice left, and the populist right. And I think that the thing that's kind of crazy about liberalism is that they're basically all anarchical systems. They're basically systems where nobody gets final say. Nobody's ultimately completely in charge. And Jonathan Rauch writes a lot of great stuff about this, and he basically talks about like the three great liberal systems being democracy, or at least democratic government, capitalism, and then what he calls liberal science. Basically, like also within the Boolean sphere of freedom of speech, that we try to figure out what's true, to also come back to a theme, through a process of debate, discussion, persuasion, etc. And it ultimately means there is no one person, one thing in charge. And that is something that I see on the populist right and to a degree on the left. On the left, they want that perfect expert. On the right, they want the big man. They want to go back without fully realizing it to most of the rest of history, where there's got to be someone in charge, right? And so like I want to defend liberalism to both right and left at the moment, because I don't think they understand what a deep, compelling, positive vision it is of something that might sound scary at some level, that essentially accepting to a degree the tremendous progress we have for systems in which no one is ultimately in charge can be a hard thing to mentally accept when you think about it, or even when you don't.
Greg and Nadine, thank you so much. This was fantastic. When is War and Words available?
July 1st. And my TED Talk comes out on June 24th. We actually were trying to line it up so they come out on the same day, but it's because my TED Talk's shockingly about freedom of speech.
The best laid plans of publishers and men.
Thank you so much, Adaam.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're feeling generous, give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends and enemies. Until next time, stay sane.